I never imagined I'd be the kind of person who spent nights alone in a cemetery. But work was work, and after a long stretch of unemployment, I wasn't in a position to be picky. The job posting had been straightforward. Night security guard needed for a private cemetery. The pay was slightly above minimum wage, the hours were terrible, and the only real requirement was that I had to be comfortable being alone. I told myself it wouldn't be so bad. Cemeteries were quiet. No rowdy customers, no late-night drunks. Just the occasional raccoon rustling through the bushes. When I was hired, the manager, an older man named Mr. Denton, walked me through my responsibilities. He explained that my main job was to make sure no one sneaked in after hours. Some people, he said, like to hang around cemeteries at night. Teenagers dared each other to trespass. Vagrants looked for a place to sleep. And occasionally, families came to visit a loved one outside of regular hours. My job was to patrol the grounds, check the perimeter, and call the police if necessary. The first few nights were uneventful. I walked my rounds, checked the gates, and returned to the small security booth near the entrance. It wasn't until my second week that I started to feel uneasy. One night, as I walked my usual route, I heard something rustling behind a row of tombstones. I froze, listening. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees that lined the cemetery's perimeter. But this was different. This was deliberate movement. I turned on my flashlight and aimed it toward the source of the noise. The beam of light swept across the graves, illuminating names and dates carved into the marble. Then I saw it. Just the briefest glimpse of a figure disappearing behind a large headstone. My heart pounded as I called out, my voice firm but nervous. There was no response. I walked forward cautiously, keeping my flashlight steady. When I rounded the headstone, expecting to find a trespasser, there was no one there. The ground was undisturbed, and the only sound was the wind. Shaking it off, I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe a trick of the light, maybe my tired mind playing games. But as the nights went on, the incidents continued. One night, as I was making my way back to the booth, I spotted movement near the far entrance. A man stood just beyond the gate, partially obscured by shadows. He was tall, thin, and wore a dark coat. Something about him set me on edge. I called out, asking if he needed help. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the tree line. I checked the gate and found the padlock intact. If he had gotten inside earlier, he must have left before I spotted him. The next night, I found something strange. Near one of the newer graves, a pile of fresh dirt had been disturbed. Not enough to suggest someone had dug a hole, but enough that it was noticeable. I shined my flashlight over the area, trying to figure out if an animal had been digging. As I crouched down, I noticed something even stranger. A shoe print. It was deep, as if someone had been standing in one place for a long time. I checked around the grave, but there were no other prints leading away. Just that single impression in the dirt. Over the next week, my unease grew. I started to dread my shifts, feeling like I was being watched. Then one night, I found something I couldn't explain. Near the security booth, a set of keys lay on the ground. I picked them up and turned them over in my hand. They weren't mine, and they weren't the cemetery's. I took them to Mr. Denton the next morning. He frowned when he saw them, his expression darkening. After a long pause, he told me something that made my skin crawl. A few months before I was hired, the last security guard had vanished. Just gone without a trace. His car had been found in the lot, and his belongings were still in the booth. But no one had seen or heard from him since. The police investigated, but with no leads, the case went cold. I stared at the keys in my hand, suddenly feeling cold. If these belonged to him, how had they ended up outside the booth months later? I finished my shift that night, but I knew I wouldn't be coming back. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. Denton didn't seem surprised. He just nodded and told me he understood. I had been digging graves for over 15 years. The work was tough, the pay wasn't great, but it had a kind of quiet dignity to it. I knew how to handle a shovel, how to cut the edges just right so the earth didn't collapse, and how to keep my head down when grieving families pass by. It wasn't a job most people wanted, but someone had to do it. I worked at Pine Hill Cemetery, a place that had been around since the late 1800s. Some of the tombstones had weathered so badly you could barely read the names. Every week, I dug the fresh ones, filled them back in, and tried not to think too much about what lay underneath. But there was one burial that stuck with me, the one that made me consider walking away for good. It was a hot summer morning when I got the work order for a fresh grave. The name on the paperwork was Evelyn Carter. Nothing unusual about that, but when I showed up to meet the funeral director, he pulled me aside. He told me the family had a special request. The casket needed to be buried deeper than usual, an extra 2 feet. I asked why, but he just shrugged and said that's what they insisted on. It wasn't the first time someone had an odd request. Some families had religious reasons, others just had their own ways of doing things. I didn't question it. I just grabbed my shovel and got to work. The first thing that felt off was how the soil settled. Normally, when I filled a grave back in, the dirt packed down evenly. This one felt different. The ground kept shifting under my boots as if the earth didn't want to stay in place. I tamped it down harder, but something about it made my skin crawl. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the grave. I told myself it was just another burial, but the next day when I walked by, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The dirt had sunk, more than it should have. I grabbed my shovel and prodded the ground. It was loose, as if someone had been tampering with it. I checked the perimeter of the cemetery for footprints or signs of trespassing, but everything was undisturbed. It didn't make sense. A few nights later, I was doing my rounds when I saw something near the fresh grave. A man, standing completely still, staring at the headstone. He was dressed in a dark suit, hands clasped in front of him. He didn't look like one of the usual mourners, too rigid, too still. I cleared my throat and asked if he needed help. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away without a word, disappearing into the darkness beyond the cemetery's fence. The next morning, I told my boss about it, but he just gave me a strange look and told me to let it go. When I pressed him, he admitted something that made my blood run cold. Evelyn Carter had already been buried once before. I stared at him, not understanding. He explained that she had died nearly 20 years ago, but the family had recently received word that the body buried in her plot wasn't actually hers. Due to a mix-up at the funeral home all those years ago, another woman had been buried in her place. When the truth came out, the family exhumed the remains, reburied the other woman properly, and finally laid Evelyn to rest where she was supposed to be. I asked why the family had wanted the casket buried so deep. My boss hesitated before answering. They didn't want another mistake. That was the last grave I ever dug. I quit a week later. I never thought I'd end up working in a cemetery, even if it was just on paper. My background was in accounting, not funeral services, but when I got laid off, I took the first decent-paying job I could find. The caretaker of Fairview Cemetery had passed away, and the city needed someone to organize the burial records before hiring a new manager. It was supposed to be a short-term assignment, just a few months of sorting through old files and digitizing records. Simple, quiet work, or so I thought. The office was a cramped space attached to a maintenance shed at the back of the cemetery. Inside were filing cabinets stuffed with yellowed papers, handwritten notes, and ledgers dating back over 100 years. Most of it was routine, names, dates, plot numbers. But after a few weeks, I found something strange. One of the ledgers didn't match the official records. According to the city's database, the cemetery held 2,134 graves, but the handwritten book listed 2,147. 13 extra names, each carefully recorded with dates and plot numbers that didn't seem to exist anywhere else. At first, I thought it was a clerical error, maybe duplicate entries or old records that had been corrected later. But when I checked the cemetery map, the plot numbers listed in the ledger pointed to an area that shouldn't have had any graves at all. Curious, I walked out to the section listed in the ledger. It was an overgrown part of the cemetery, near the fence line, where no recent burials had taken place. There were no headstones, no markers, just grass, trees, and a few sunken spots in the earth that looked suspiciously like unmarked graves. I mentioned it to the groundskeeper, an old man named Roy who had been working there for decades. He went quiet for a long moment before shaking his head. He told me I was better off not asking questions. Some records, he said, were kept off the books for a reason. That answer didn't sit well with me. I wasn't looking for trouble, but I couldn't ignore what I had found. That night, I stayed late, poring over the ledger and cross-referencing names with public records. What I found made my stomach drop. None of the 13 names existed in any official capacity. No birth records, no death certificates, nothing. It was as if these people had never existed at all. The next morning, I arrived early and found the office door unlocked. The ledger was gone. I searched everywhere, but it had vanished without a trace. The other records were untouched, but the one book that held the extra names was missing. When I asked Roy, he just muttered that some things weren't meant to be recorded and walked away. That was when I decided I had seen enough. I finished my contract, handed in my final reports, and didn't ask any more questions. But even now, I can't stop thinking about those missing names. A few weeks after I left, I drove past the cemetery one last time. The overgrown section had been cleared, the sunken spots in the earth smoothed over as if they had never been there. Whatever was hidden in those records had been erased for good. I don't know who those people were, or why they were buried without names, but someone had made sure their existence disappeared.